This happened 4 years ago, in a small town in Eastern Europe. I was 18 at the time, freshly graduated from high school. Well, our town is surrounded by woods, so if you follow a random road, there's a high chance that you will end up on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, which isn't even on Google Maps. Me and my friends were very adventurous, because we were dumb teens. And we had a license. So being that our town had very few and boring places to hang out, we pretty much explored all the country dirt roads. One night in August, we decided to go on a night drive to a place that we had never been to before. And we liked the fact that we had never seen a car driving there, so we could smoke, drink, blast music without disturbing anyone. We named the place the Botanical Garden, simply because it was about 20 miles away, on a road surrounded by undisturbed forests on both sides. We were 2 cars full with people. I was driving mine and Elena the other. We arrived at the place at about 11 p.m. and we started doing our usual dumb things. As a matter of fact, I don't smoke, and I couldn't drink since I was the driver. So I didn't think I imagined what happened next. We were just laughing like idiots when Elena turned the music volume down a little and told us to be quiet. We asked her why, but she didn't respond. She was focused on hearing something. "Guys, you didn't hear that?" "Hear what?" we asked her. She explained to us that she went a little closer to the woods and heard something like a crying woman. She was genuinely scared. I could see in her face the fear. And while I was telling her that it was most likely a fox or another animal, a few of my high and drunk friends started bluffing, screaming at whatever it was to go away, and that we would beat the shit out of it. Suddenly, we began hearing rhythmic screams 10 seconds away from each other. But what really scared me was that every scream sounded like it was getting closer to us. To be honest, I really thought that there was someone that needed help. But those screams were something scarier than something in a horror movie, and I can still hear it sometimes in my nightmares today. I know we were dumb, but we didn't move a muscle. I don't know why. We were just staring at each other and not saying anything with our scared faces. I think it was the fact that we were like 10 people. And we also had pepper spray, just in case we ran into somebody we didn't want to. The girls were the first who made a dash for the cars, followed by everyone soon. I turned my car, and as soon as my headlights came, I could see someone standing in the woods, behind a tree. It looked like a woman, but she was very old and looked hunched and had some kind of walking stick. I can't remember what she was wearing, but her whole face was covered, and I couldn't stay too long because my friends were screaming to floor it, so I did. We drove back to town and we stopped at a gas station for gas and to collect our thoughts. Everyone was puzzled, and everyone saw the old woman. My friends in the car behind us even said that the old woman got out of the woods, like she was chasing after the car. I have absolutely no idea what we saw that night. I haven't been back there at night, and we told other friends what we experienced, and a group went to see for themselves. All I say is that they hesitated to tell us what went down. They just told us that they were too creeped out and booked it out of there very quickly. I don't know if we saw some kind of spirit, a demented woman, or if it was a sick but well-played prank, although I do doubt that, because this place is in the absolute middle of nowhere. that no one has any business just waiting there to prank people. Hell, we still weren't sure which destination we were going to before we even got there, so it couldn't have been anyone outside our circle of friends who they told to try and play the prank on us. Not to mention the fact that we didn't see a single car, and people here don't really do these kind of things. Our folklore has many legends about spirits that haunt the woods at night. Stories that my grandma would tell me as a child, but I never believed them. I think I will never know what happened that night, and honestly, I really don't want to know. This was a sort of string of several incidents that climaxed in one big thing that got us all sent home for the first day. Firstly, the school I'm referring to is pretty old, built during the British occupation, and actually contained secret exits and stuff. Certain parts of the school were permanently closed, which of course led to rumours among the students. My favourite was that a deformed kid lived in there, forever shunned by the school. Secondly, we all witnessed a shaken, crying janitor being escorted out by some teachers who were trying to calm her down. We were all told she was ill, but the rumour was that she saw something she should have never seen in one of the stairwells near the locked area. Third, the ever-popular toilet, where all the boys went to secretly have a smoke. It was a boys' school. In the same week as the janitor's breakdown, there was a huge gathering at the toilet, and we saw teachers yelling at kids to get back to their classrooms. The toilets were shut down, and the rumour that one of the boys was taking a huge dump. When he came out of his cubicle, he saw several wet long hairs plastered on the wall. Think The Grudge. The grand finale was that someone got possessed. One of the boys went into a frenzy and had to be held down. He was speaking in a very strange dialect that was quite alien in the area, and strangest of all, in an audibly woman's voice. His parents and an ambulance had to be called. Sometime later, we were all told that we could leave for the day. More rumours, as after we left, the school got a priest or medicine man to cleanse the school. No joke. I honestly thought I have no time for the superstitions, but I'm surrounded with them. So it can get interesting. And it got me a day off school. Thanks, creepy demonic entity. Me and my boyfriend love to camp. About 2 weeks ago, we decided to go to the coast because we had a Friday off from our classes in university and decided to hike and camp out for the weekend. We had a 3-day plan to stay in 3 different towns and hike to each place. This story is about the first place that we stayed in. The first town was barely a town. It was more like a bunch of small houses and farmland and very, very few people. It was off-season, so normally there would have been some tourists, and since the main attraction is a huge abandoned city, left over from the times of the ancient Greek civilization, we thought it'd be rather popular. Anyway, since there were about 5 to 6 camping grounds available, one of which was highly recommended on TripAdvisor and the like, we didn't bother calling beforehand. We simply headed there and went straight to that camping area. Upon reaching it, we saw the gate open, which wasn't really unusual, but when we entered it, no one seemed to be there. We knocked and called out for someone, and no one responded, except the outdoor bar, which was all open with expensive bottles of alcohol lining up and food left on the kitchen table, as we saw from the windows, so they couldn't have gone far. My boyfriend found it a bit strange that they would leave everything open like that, but assuming it was a small community with no crime, we didn't think much of it. We went to some other camping grounds to ask if they were open. The first one we went into said that they were closed due to their campgrounds being very messy these days, but they recommended us another place. We asked them about the first ground that we had went to, and strangely, the man said not to go there. We asked him why, and he just said, "I just don't recommend you going there." Anyway, the other place he told us to go about was also closed, and luckily in the meantime, I found a signboard for the first place, and it had their number on it. We called them and a man picked up, and told us that he and his wife were out for a couple of hours, and would be back in the evening. He said we could set up our camp, and that we would meet later. The place was a bit secluded, but it was quite picturesque, and we set our camp and left. We spent the whole day exploring and hiking around, and after a tiring day at around 10 p.m, after dinner, we started heading back. This is where things go extra creepy. When we got back, we found the place still empty. No one had returned, and it was quite late. My boyfriend called the owners again, and they said they had decided not to return tonight, but that we could leave the money under a table mat by the door. They said the kitchen and bathrooms are open if we needed to use them, and the place was dark, and the yard was where we had set up camp, and was huge without any lighting. My boyfriend immediately starts to feel a bit uneasy. He was concerned why two business owners would leave their property completely open to two total strangers with a bar full of unopened bottles and a half-open house. As we walked towards our camp, he kept subtly expressing his uneasiness and kept looking around. He usually was pretty calm, so I told him that if he wasn't feeling so strongly about this, that we could just go to where we had had dinner earlier and stay the night in a hotel room. He opened the flashlight of his phone and kept looking around, getting more uneasy. So we agreed to pack up our camp and leave. I began to pack up, since it required a lot of folding, and he was already anxious, and I told him to just stand there and give me the light. As I packed it up, but constantly, he would move the light and check the area, as I kept getting irritated, because I could sense his worry, and at the time, I couldn't pack fast enough, because I couldn't see. At one point, he even told me in a slightly bitchy way to hurry up. And as soon as I folded the camp, we stuffed it into a bag and hurriedly packed our shit and scooted. He still seemed super anxious, and I told him to relax. The road back to the main area of the town was dark and lonely, and this is where he told me there's something I wanted to say, but not while we were still on the grounds. "Well, what is it?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he said he didn't want to freak me out, but he was sure that he saw someone lurking in the dark behind the wooden cabins and by the bathrooms. Twice. No one was supposed to be there except for us, and I got the chills, but I still tried to rationalize, saying it's a farm area and there must be loads of animals. Maybe a cat was moving around, but he was adamant it was a human, walking like a human would, and standing. That is why he kept checking and wanting us to hurry so much. And that's why he was telling me to hush and to keep my voice down. I almost had tears in my eyes at this point, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I kept looking back, and almost running at this point, to the lighted area of the quiet town, and only relaxed until we reached the mansion and booked the room there. We got the key, locked it, and checked it twice. I'm generally quite a skeptical person, but I really do believe my boyfriend didn't just see things. I don't know who was back there, or what could have happened, if anything, and I don't care to know. Dark and isolated places have always creeped me out. I'm glad I never met that person. Last year, I was with a buddy of mine, and we were going to do the Hart Creek Scramble in Alberta. But due to some health conditions he had, it was going to be too strenuous to complete, and we figured we'd make it an easy day and just do the simple trail. Now, we're both climbers and have been to Hart Creek for rock climbing in the past, and had a great time. So it wasn't a surprise to see the sporadic climbers on the mountainside as we went. Hart Creek is also pretty popular, and easy for people who just want to go and have a nice nature walk, and maybe indulge in a picnic. Anyway, so we walked in enjoying the day, watching climbers on our way by. We saw a couple even doing some multi-pitch climbing, which means basically leapfrogging up the route. We settled in for lunch about a half hour later, and left a couple of hours after that. On our way back, I remember seeing a climbing shoe in the creek and thinking, "Oh, someone must have lost this," and picked it up, when my buddy got my attention and I looked further downstream. Both climbers, a young man 29 and his partner, were both lying in the creek bed, rope and harness still attached, dead. It was very surreal. We had seen these people climbing not 2 hours before, making their calls, having a good time. The first reaction I had was that there was family right behind us, a husband and wife with a young daughter who were playing in the creek on the way down. We ran back and stopped them and explained as quietly as we could what was ahead, and before we knew it, Lucky Lou had come by. It turned out that the husband was an off-duty RCMP, and he took control of the situation. I later learnt we weren't the first on the scene, and that the authorities had been called. It was a very quiet ride back into town that day, though. This happened when I was 16. I am now 35. My cousin moved to Phoenix, Arizona, one summer for a job. He offered to put me up for a week and buy me a bus ticket back home if I agreed to help move down. I agreed, and we headed on the 12+ hour drive to Phoenix. The drive from Salt Lake City to Phoenix is long, dry, and boring. The town of Kanab, Utah, was an interesting stop on our way. The town is semi-famous as a popular destination for the filming of Western films. John Wayne made several films there. The town was also home to a restaurant employing one of the worst waitresses in waitressing history. The border of Arizona is not far from Kanab, and shortly after crossing it, I witnessed some scary shit. Desert was all that surrounded us, and we drove down the dark Arizona highway. An occasional truck or car or diesel appeared, but we were mostly alone. The northern portion of Arizona's highway is sprinkled with frequent Native American stores, but much of the landscape is decorated by abandoned, simply made wooden structures that used to sell handmade Native American items. One can imagine a time when these structures housed a proud, lively business. Now these abandoned structures are little more than wood colored by poorly designed graffiti, which makes the sad, boring, lonely desert drive even more of a depressing undertake. It must have been about an hour or so after passing and stopping to pee at some dam on the Arizona-Utah border. My bad memory tells me that the visitor center at the dam was closed So we peed in some bushes in the desert. But there's a good chance that we just decided to pee in the desert because it was easier. Either way, we peed in the desert. I was afraid to go in the desert because I'm absolutely convinced that everything there can kill you. Between the Gila monsters and the heat, there are a ton of deadly assassins in the desert. Soon after we left the damn dam, we were driving down the now dark, scary highway. As we continued down a straight path, we saw a person walking 100 yards or so away. The person was on the side of the road and was heading in the same direction that we were. The second we both saw the person, my cousin asked if we should pick them up, and of course I said no. I knew my cousin was joking, but I intended on immediately ending any conversation about it. As we came closer to the person, we saw that it was wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt, and I realized it was definitely a man. Upon realizing it was a man, my cousin made a joke about not picking up the person because they were not pretty enough. I laughed, but I didn't give a shit if it were a woman, or how big her hypothetical boobs would have been. I would have screamed and slapped my cousin if he would have pulled the car over. About 20 feet from the man, and we saw that he was hitchhiking. As we passed the man, we looked up at him, as he did us, and we saw his face. It looked older than his body frame, much older. He had the shape of the frame of a man in his 20s, but his face looked like a man in his 80s. I stared at the man as we passed, and he stared back. I'm making deep eye contact. Obviously, the exchange lasted a brief moment, but it was impactful. We passed the man, and my cousin yelled out to him, and we cruised past. I calmed down after, and he was out of the rearview mirror, but the impact of that brief moment seemed to resonate. A couple of miles down the road, my cousin began acting strange, then quoted the Cheech and Chong film Up in Smoke, before looking at me with a vicious stare and a joint in his mouth. This brought me out of the funk, and we pulled over to the other side of the road for a smoke break. We sat on the side of the creepy desert highway as we listened to Rage Against the Machine and attempted to smoke ourselves into oblivion. We had planned on hanging out a little before we continued our drive, after the joint was gone. But as I watched my cousin fumble for a Zippo lighter, I noticed something scary in the rearview mirror. The creepy hitchhiker was right behind us. I was so scared I didn't know how to react. I wanted to look cool to my cousin, but I was scared to death. I remember trying to be as quiet as possible and told my cousin what was happening. And he was so busy trying to get the poorly produced joint to light that he didn't hear me. The man walked right up to my passenger side window and stopped and smiled at me, and he made the roll down your window hand sign, and I screamed. And I'm not proud of myself, but I screamed really loud. I also hit my cousin and knocked the joint out of his hand, and he looked at me and yelled when he saw the old man. To this day, my cousin says he didn't scream, but he did. We take off down the road fast. About a mile or so down the road, we both calmed down, and we became curious. So we decided to turn around and drive back past the man. My cousin wanted to see his face again, but I felt like I had seen enough. In an attempt to be cool, I went along with the idea to turn around, and as we drove backwards towards the original spot, we saw the man again. He was still walking in the same way, and he was still on the same side of the road. He looked up at us again, and he looked scary. We both quietly yelled in the car and continued down along the road, in the wrong direction for a minute or so. and eventually we turned around again. As we did, the man was still very much in sight, but in the dark of the night he was making it more difficult to see him. As we completed the turn, and were again on the right side of the road, where the lights would have made it easier to see him, when the lights first illuminated the man, only his lower portion was visible from a distance away. But as we got closer, he disappeared and was gone. We spent another 30 minutes driving in the area. We kept a close watch on the sides of the roads, and my cousin spent several minutes outside the car whilst taking a closer look into the desert, and the man was gone. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know something was wrong with it. I was raised in a fundamentalist, extreme right-wing home. I only went to ACE schools, where one or more of my family was on staff. The same families that made up the school made up the church that ran the school. In this sense, you were with the same group of people pretty much 24/7, and outsiders were rare. Rules included: girls were never to be alone with boys, separate PE, lunch, break times, sides of the room, especially during chapel, no braids or intricate hair design, no pants for girls or women, no makeup, no coloured lip gloss, no secular music, movies, literature, or talk of any of the above. No TV in the home, and my parents fortunately had one hidden in their closet so that they could watch the news in case of an emergency. Spankings were an acceptable form of punishment from anyone at any time for any reason. There was one family that any time I replied to a question the mother or father asked me was considered disrespectful, so they would spank me. Then I'd get it again when I got home for embarrassing and disrespecting my family. I believe now that they had issues with my dad and took it out on me. The school I graduated from was nationally known and looked up for leadership example from most of the ACE community. FYI to all you ACE alumni, it was all a lie. The discrimination, backstabbing and inappropriateness ran rampant. It was horrible to hear the preacher talk about love and acceptance on Sunday and Wednesdays and Fridays, and then be told by the same person and your supervisors, that's what we called our teachers, that you couldn't hang out or talk to anyone that didn't go to our school, not even students from other ACE schools. I left when I graduated at 16. I had already bucked the system for several years, and they were happy to see me go. The saddest part of it all, my family is still heavily involved. This happened while I was backpacking in the Goat Rocks Wilderness in Washington State. My friends and I were trying to get up into a certain basin above the tree line, and we got a really late start thanks to road construction. So we were really hoofing it up the trail, trying to make camp before dark. My friend hikes way faster than I do, so he got way out ahead of me. And by the time I got to where our detour from the main trail up an informal boot path would take us up into the basin, he was nowhere to be seen. So there were no campsites near where I stopped. I backtracked for about 3/4 of a mile to a lake where there were established campsites right along the trail. After maybe an hour, my friend shows up having realized his mistake, and this was well after dark, and we settled in, not really knowing our surroundings. It was a fairly large open area though, likely a horse camp area, because the trail is popular with horse packers, but we had encountered none. we set up our tents, which were both one-person tents, ate, and went to bed. Neither of us usually slept well when backpacking, but for whatever reason, he was out cold, and I was sort of lucid. But for quite a while, I was just listening to the sounds of nature and trying not to psych myself out about the possible demons and monsters and man-eating beasts lurking in the woods every time I heard a twig snap or a pinecone fall from a tree. So maybe 3 hours or so after I went to bed, which would have been roughly 1 a.m., I start hearing a very distinct sound of really heavy footsteps around my camp area, maybe as much as 100 feet away. I didn't really think to analyze the patterns of the footsteps made at the time, but I remember it sounding distinctly bipedal. You can usually pick out deer or mountain goat because they don't plant their feet in pairs, other than the occasional footstep. It's basically dead silent. No crickets or rustlings of bushings or anything. That silence was instantly shattered by the most terrifying sound I've ever heard in my life. It was basically the same intensity as a whistle on a steam train, but much, much deeper and more demonic-like. Almost like a cross between a cow mooing and a lion's roar, but loud enough that it echoed off the mountains on the opposite side of the valley. Immediately after the noise, this creature went hauling arse off into the woods, crashing through the bushes. The forest I could see where I set up camp was basically covered in high-head huckleberry shrubs, but remained running around in earshot for at least 2 minutes, running back and forth sometimes, getting distinctly closer, and sometimes getting further away. All this time, it sounded like it was a creature with 2 legs running about. This whole time, my heart was doing about 200 beats a minute, and I was sure I was going to be eaten by a chupacabra or something. After a couple of minutes, the footsteps faded, and it fell silent again, and I never heard anything else. I probably lay awake for at least another hour before I finally slept. My friend didn't hear a damn thing. In the morning when I woke up, I looked around, and there was a wide open area that led down to a small beach by the nearby lake, to see if there was any evidence of what the noise was. Turns out, there were fresh elk print in the mud, near the lake, and maybe 20 to 30 feet away was a large print of either a cougar or a bear. So likely something was stalking one of the elk that wandered near my camp, and spooked it in the middle of the night, and caused it to spaz out. At least, that's what I hope it was. The moral of the story is, all elk are possessed, all the time. I was about 14 when this happened. I was in my bed trying to sleep, but as always, I was failing. My dad was in the living room trying to rock my brothers asleep. This was a normal routine, but this night wasn't normal. I finally think I'm falling to sleep when I hear 3 loud knocks on the front door. It echoed throughout the whole house. It's 3 a.m. and the knocks are followed by a girl screaming. She screams for help and that her mother needs help, over and over. She was practically shrieking. My dad assumes it's some sort of trap. They use a little girl. Dad becomes vulnerable, opens door, and easy access inside the house and so forth. So he's yelling back at her to leave us alone through the door. The little girl starts crying, kicking our door over and over. her screams still ring in my head every now and then. But by this point, I'm sitting upright in my bed, crying as well. I'm terrified and upset with my dad, because what if she needs help? So maybe 10 minutes go by of this continuous crying and screaming, when I hear a man outside my window, which is only a few inches beside my door. I hear him telling the little girl to shut up, and I can hear him grab her as she's screaming for him to let go. And I felt my stomach go sick. I wanted to look out my window, but I was paralyzed with fear. I can tell he's dragged her into the street. Her screams for her mother become quieter the further they got. And soon, I hear about 3 cars speed off down the street, and a lot of men were yelling. My parents called the police and tried to tell me to go to sleep, but I was too scared and traumatized. To this day, I think about that little girl and her mother all the time, scared of what might have happened to them. I used to want to know, but now I don't think I want to. I am not easily spooked. It takes a lot to throw me off balance. But the story I'm about to tell really did shake me up and left me wondering if it's ever really going to be over. I'm a 29-year-old single woman. My career has been my main focus, and as a result, I've been successful at what I do. I am a safety consultant. I love the irony. And I go to people's homes or workplaces to improve their safety. Maybe it's my profession that made me feel like nothing bad would ever happen to me. Spotting risks and dealing with them is what I do best. It started off innocently enough. The first time I remember seeing him was when I was stuck in traffic and he was the driver in the car behind me. I saw him in the rearview mirror and he was smiling and doing a "what can you do about it" gesture. He had snacks and a thermos and started making himself comfy in the car. He seemed like a relaxed kind of guy. The cause of the traffic block was an accident, and we were stuck for a long time. I guess that's why I remembered his face in his car so well later. So anyway, a bit after in that same week, I was on my way home from work, which is about a 20-minute drive, and I spot him in his white Volvo behind me once more. I make my way through town, and he is still behind me. At this point, my overtly risk-calculating mind tells me not to go straight home. I was not feeling threatened or scared, just mentally making notes that this man seems to drive the exact same route as I do. I stop at the coffee shop and set off on a mission to feed my caffeine addiction. And when I come out back, I had almost forgotten about the Volvo until I stop at the last red light before reaching my street, and I see him behind me once again. I wondered if he wanted to ask me something. As I got out of my car, I had my pepper spray ready in my pocket, just in case. But the Volvo drove straight past me, and the driver did not even look my way. I'm just being overly paranoid then, I thought. My co-workers said it would happen if you stayed in the business for too long. Fast forward a few days. I was working late one night and suddenly got a text message. I got the kind of alarm system at my house that will send you a text if anyone tries to get in or tampers with the alarm. I hurried home to check, but found nothing out of order. A case of malfunctioning, maybe? The next morning, my boss phoned me, and asked if I wanted to go meet with a client out of town. He had asked for me, a recommendation from another client. Flattered and eager to land a new big client, I agreed. Since I have zero talent for map reading and finding my way, I used the GPS in my phone to get the address right. The longer I drove, the less eager I became. The risk calculator in my mind woke up, pointing its index finger at the things that didn't totally make sense. Why did the client say no to the normal process? A telephone contact to discuss the situation and get a picture of what it is that we can do and what it would cost in order for us to get involved. Why a meeting right away? And without giving any details about what sort of property it was. I stopped the car and considered the situation. Was I overthinking it? Had I started to become really paranoid without noticing? Or was there something strange about this? I decided that I was probably seeing patterns that weren't there, and I went ahead to find the address. It was hard as the GPS on the phone stopped working, with no service out here in the middle of nowhere. As I saw the property, I got a strange feeling again. It didn't look like a place that anyone would invest any significant amount of money to protect. It was an old building, old tires, and junk scattered around the yard, and nothing of value anywhere to be seen. Who would want to go out of their way to protect this? Following my instincts, I drove around the property to the back of the building, and I didn't see anyone around, which added to the growing feeling of get the hell out. As I drove around the corner, I saw a tarp covering a car. The tarp was too small to cover the whole vehicle, and I immediately recognized the shape and colour of the white Volvo. I locked the doors and started to turn the car around, and suddenly there he was, blocking my exit. He was dressed in a suit that looked like it had seen the light of day when his grandpa was younger. He wasn't smiling anymore, not looking like a nice, relaxed guy. He was looking nervous and strained. He started walking towards me, and I could see that he was wearing thick leather gloves despite the hot weather. I looked for an alternative way out, because, let's face it, you don't want to run a person over if you can avoid it. It would be hard to claim self-defense without any harm done to me. Maybe he was just a socially challenged person who didn't know how to show his interest in a normal way. "Come on out," he said, with his voice sugar sweet, but his face showed no emotion. "Get out of my way," I said, opening the window a small amount. "I just want to talk to you. Please shut off the engine and talk to me. I made scones especially for you. I just want to chat." Saying this, he looked very sad and defeated and lonely, and I almost fell for it. What if he was just really lonely and wanted to invite someone over and had no idea how to do it? The gloves, the hidden car, the alarm system at your house? My inner voice reminded me. "Please don't be mad. I just wanted to surprise you. Don't you like surprises? All the magazines say that you should surprise your lady with spontaneous romantic things, and I cooked, just for you. Please at least let me show you the decorations I made. Please?" He thinks I'm his girlfriend? Holy shit. Okay. I smiled. I understood. "You spooked me at first, that's all. But I recognize you now. I'll just park the car on the front yard, and then we can go have scones. The moment I finished my sentence, he started shaking his head. No, park here, it's okay. Okay, I said, still smiling as convincing as I could, turning off the engine. Then I started pulling at the locked door, pretending it was stuck. Oh my god, the door is doing this again. Damn it, I meant to get it fixed, but I never had the time to take it to the garage. You know what it's like, right? Maybe you can do it for me someday, sweetie. He nods happily and runs up to the car to help me with the door. He pulls downwards and gives it a really hard yank. I instructed as I slowly moved my hand into the ignition. I got the car going, with him still holding onto the door for dear life. He cried and screamed and kicked as hard as he could, but he had to let go. And I drove home, constantly looking back in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the Volvo. As I stopped at a gas station, I phoned the police and my boss, and I started to feel sorry for him. How sad a life he must have had. The police arrived at the location, but the Volvo man wasn't there anymore. Turned out, he didn't own the place either. It was all a lie. They did find a table set for two, with roses and scones and now cold tea. They also found a box in the bathroom, containing duct tape, cuffs, a woman's nightgown, and a jewellery box with an engagement ring. In the kitchen, they found in an old bread box photos that he'd taken from the car and photos of my house. I don't know if this is all over, or if he has found someone else to propose to, or if he is planning to try it again with me. I have since started to bring my gun to most places, and if he does try again, I will be ready. A part of me feels very sorry for him for being so at odds with the rest of the world. Another part, my inner survivalist, is ready to take him down the moment he suggests we have scones and tea again. When I was in 6th grade, a friend and I went to another girl's house, which was in the country. A few days before Halloween, we wanted spooky things to happen. So we did the typical preteen girl creepy slumber party activities, like playing with the Ouija board and doing Bloody Mary. The next evening, the girl who lived there told us that she heard of a crazy lady who lived nearby and threw plates at people. We decided to take their golf cart and try and find her, and videotape her throwing plates at us. We didn't. We got lost in the woods instead. All of a sudden, I saw something, or someone, floating in the distance. My friend turned on the video camera, and we got out of the golf cart to creep closer. We were scared but curious at this point. "It's a person," I remember whispering when we were close. "He's dead." "No, it's just a Halloween decoration," my friend insisted. It wasn't a Halloween decoration. It was a dead body hanging from a tree. At first, we thought he was murdered, then put on display. We were freaking out. The concept of suicide was not well formed in our heads, but the knocked over ladder and the note tacked to the tree, which we didn't read, proved otherwise. My friend called the cops, and when they arrived we were told to leave immediately. I remember tons of police cars and ambulances arrived. They made us turn off the video camera, which had been rolling the entire time. Her mother was called, and we were all taken back to the house. The parents tried to convince us, as we sat in the kitchen, that it simply was a Halloween decoration. But police didn't send kids home if it isn't a dead body. Every year before Halloween, I have nightmares sparked by this event. I am on a hill in the dark, and there are dead trees surrounding me, with a dead body hanging from each one. This must have been around 1992, and I was camping and hiking with a friend of mine in the Lake District, and we were making our way through Borrowdale along the Derwent. It's a popular spot of the country, and there's always plenty of tourists out and about. I was following my friend, and we rounded a large boulder, and then he stopped. We did that comedy thing of me not paying attention and bumping into him behind. He indicates to me to shush, and I poke my head around to see what made him stop. Stood in the middle of the river was a masturbating man. Shirt pulled up and tucked under his chin, trousers nowhere to be seen. We sniggered, shook our heads, and took a different route. He didn't see us. We ambled and dawdled further along, and after, we stopped for a snack, and we could hear what sounded like girls squealing. We decided to investigate, and who did we see but the masturbator once again, with trousers around his ankles this time. Only this time, he's flashing at girls on the other side of the river. Gripped by an adolescent sense of justice, we decided that something must be done, but being a pair of fairly weedy nerds, we thought getting the police would be better. It was agreed that my friend would jog up to the nearest road, flag down someone to call the police, and I'd remain behind to keep an eye on Mr. Wavy Penis. I skulked, unseen behind a tree, and kept watch. After a couple of minutes, something must have unnerved the wanker. I am assuming an infuriated parent started to wade across the river or something, as he left the riverbank and headed straight through the woods towards where I was hiding. I was sitting in a hollow in the roots of a tree, and he walked straight past me and turned to look behind him. He was only feet away, and I stopped breathing. He stared through the trees for what felt like an eternity, and I thought I was doomed. Then he just turned away and headed back up to the road. I followed him to the road and figured out that he was heading for the nearest car park. My friend had gone that way to call someone to get the police, so we met up as he was coming back to find me, and we were able to get the registration of the van that the flashman had gotten into. Within a minute of him driving off, a police car arrived, giving the full blue lights and squealing tires. We waved them down, and they were there to respond to the call that my friend had convinced someone to make when they called 999 for us. We gave a brief description and the van details, and the police were delighted, as this guy had been doing this for a few years, but people would see him and run off to call the police. But they never managed to catch him before. How did we ever cope before mobiles? And he would have disappeared, of course, by the time they arrived. We arranged to make fuller statements at the station and started to drive back. Luckily, we were parked in the same car park, and the police would follow us back to Keswick. About halfway back along the valley, I checked my rearview mirror and saw the police car slam on the brakes and throw on the lights, and then they disappeared down a track along the road. When we got to the station to make our statements, we were pulled into a side room and told to be quiet. The policeman told us that they had spotted the van as we were driving back and had gone looking for him. They'd found the flasher with his shirt off and flies undone, prowling through the woods. Unfortunately, there were no available cells in the station, so he was being held in one of the offices next to where we were. Arrangements were made to return to take part in an identity parade and point to our man. When we did return later, the police told us that he had now refused to take part in an ID parade, so we were asked whether we would be prepared to be taken into the room that he was being held in, look him in the eye and confirm it was the flasher. We agreed. It's not like we had to live there and confirmed it was the guy. Full statements were given, justice was done, and we would eventually receive a lovely letter from the Cumbrian top cop thanking us for our efforts. As we left the station, feeling rather exhilarated after our small adventure, Mr. Wagglenob's wife arrived. Before the doors fully closed behind us, we could hear her shouting, "You dirty prick! You've been doing it again, haven't you?" I used to work the 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift as a nursing assistant. This was about 15 years ago. I worked the surgical floor, so most patients were pre/post-op, but they would send up overflow from time to time. So we did have a death on occasion. Hospitals are generally well staffed at night, so I didn't spend a ton of time alone, but as an assistant, things like bathing people and changing beds were part of my job. One night, I was giving a patient a bath. He was elderly and barely there in all senses, when I heard knocking. I checked the door and no one was around, so I shrugged it off and went back to work. Again, knocking, but it didn't sound like the door. The third time, I realized it was coming from the window. At first, it confused me, so I just opened up the blinds, thinking maybe some kids were running around playing a joke. There were apartments nearby, and kids are weird. When I opened the blinds, I suddenly remembered that we were on the second floor overlooking the parking lot. This sent chills down my spine, and I wanted to see if there was any movement or reasonable explanation. When nothing presented itself, I just freaked out internally. I tried rushing through the rest of the bed bath, hoping it was over, when the knocking happened again. This time I didn't look out. I finished up, grabbed my stuff and got out of there. He ended up passing away a few hours later. I told a few co-workers and they didn't seem surprised, and just kinda said that weird stuff like that happens all the time, and that I just have to get used to it. Every summer, I go camping at the same campsite with my grandparents. Now, I was probably 10 years old when this happened, so I don't remember everything. The campsite had separated showers and bathrooms for both males and females. One night, I decided to go and take a shower. My gran was a few camping spots over from ours, having a few drinks with friends, so I didn't want to pull her away. My grandpa couldn't take me into the showers, so I went alone. Stupid, right? Anyway, as I was approaching the showers, I heard a man probably in his late 30s screaming many things to what seemed like two girls. It was late, and it was pretty dark, so I would have to get closer to have seen them. When I took a turn into the building, I saw the man was the one who was yelling, waiting outside of the girls' bathroom. Me being an innocent tater-tot, I didn't think anything of it. I was walking towards the door that the man was standing by and said, "Excuse me, sir, people are trying to sleep." Even as a child I was pretty brave, but something about him made me feel like I had to run the other way. He turned to me and I could finally see what his face looked like. He was a dark man with a scruffy beard, and he was wearing a black hoodie that covered his head. He laughed at me and put his hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, sweetie. I'll keep it down." After that, I rushed into the shower room. Once I closed the door and locked it, I guess he had heard the lock turn because he whispered, "Shit," and knocked on the door and asked if I could unlock it for him. I ignored it because I heard a whimper behind me. There was an older lady and a little girl, who I guess was her daughter. The mother was holding onto her daughter in the corner, and this made me very confused. I asked her what was wrong, and she said very, very quietly, "That man is trying to abduct us." She sobbed and bared her head into the girl's neck. I told her that I was going to go for help. At first, she didn't want me to go near him again, but I told her that I knew this campsite like the back of my hand, which I do. And I think the guy didn't realize that there was another exit. Criminals these days, jeez. I told her to stay here and lock the door after I left. I ran to the front desk and told the lady working there that there was a man scaring two girls that are hiding in the bathroom. I could tell that she was terrified, but she tried to be calm with me. She called what I guess was the police, because a few minutes later I heard the sirens. I wasn't allowed to leave the office, but when I saw the police trucks leave, I saw the man in the back seat, and he looked at me and gave me an evil smile. My grandparents were notified, but they never said anything to me other than, "You probably just saved 2 lives today." I didn't really think about this until now, many, many years later, because I just got a call today that my grandparents want to have a family get-together at the same campsite. When my sister was 4 years old and I was 3, we went to visit my grandparents' summer house in the Adirondack on a lake. My grandmother had inherited the house from her father. It was a beautiful old Victorian built in the 1880s. Once we got there, my sister started talking about a friend who she met at the house called Missy. She said Missy lived in the house. My parents assumed Missy was an imaginary friend, and at first thought the whole idea was cute. However, my sister became fixated on Missy, and the imaginary friend novelty part wore off. At some point during the visit, we drove past a graveyard, and my sister started freaking out, screaming, "Missy lives there!" My parents decided that they would take my sister to a therapist when we got home. However, my sister never brought Missy up again after we left that summer. About 20 years later, we learned that the house was originally built by a dentist. He had a brother who was a doctor who built a nearby house on a lake. That house still belonged to the family of the doctor. Our house met theirs, and they told us that the dentist who had built our house and his family had abandoned our house after his young daughter drowned off the docks. We never learnt the girl's name, but I wonder if she was called Missy. When I was younger, I lived on an estate of houses that backed onto a huge field where many people walked their dogs. It was even used as a cut-through to the next neighborhood, which would take approximately 25 minutes to walk through. When I was about 13, my neighbor and I decided to camp out for the night in the back of my garden, which, apart from a 6-foot wooden fence, was completely open to the field, albeit with 20 trees around the fence. Seeing as we were into Action Man figures at the time, we decided to make the tent a hideout. So we got together with some branches and one of those army nets to put over the tent to make it a bit more stealthy. We also put the tent in the corner of the back garden, which had a small roof over it, which made it very dark once the sun went down. We did the usual thing, ate loads of crisps and sweets, before we decided to try and get some sleep in our well-hidden, super dark tent. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone landing and then walking on the small stones. I then realized that below the fence that my mum and dad had decorated, there was some gravel and flower pots. At first I thought it was our cat, but it was far too loud to be such a small animal. I slowly sat up, trying not to make too much noise from my sleeping bag, and then I heard it again. I, once again, tried to make my way to the front of the tent silently, and looked through the zipper. About 10 feet away from us, there were 2 guys dressed all in black, crouching under the windowsill of the kitchen talking to each other. I immediately froze and had no idea what to do. They proceeded to creep closer to us, looking for more windows or maybe an entrance. But because we were in the corner of the garden, we were quite close to the path that led down the side of our houses, where there was a door into the adjoining garage. I heard them talking quite clearly, as they were now less than 5 feet away from me and my friend who was still asleep. They were talking about being unseen, and just taking whatever they could find in the garage instead of breaking into the house and disturbing anyone. I had no idea what to do, so I rang the house phone, which was pretty loud, and waited for someone to answer. It took a while as it was very early, and as soon as the phone rang, the 2 people bolted to the fence and hopped over it. My dad answered, and I whispered for him to get outside ASAP with a bat or something. Nothing happened in the end, but I'm glad that my friend slept silently that night. When I was around 20, I was going to school in Pittsburgh, living in an area mostly surrounded by the universities. I was alone in my basement apartment for the weekend. It was Friday night at around 8 p.m, and I was alone letting myself wind down for the night. I had to be up at 4 a.m. next morning to open up at the bagel shop, and there was a tap at the back door. Not a knock, think Morse code. Most of the houses I've lived up at were old in Maine, and this wasn't an exception. I wrote it off and kept watching TV. The tapping sound started again, and I was hoping to ignore it, but I realized I couldn't ignore the mass volume of people who requested it. It was too perfect to be a house settling, and I realized there was something to it. This would usually be all good and well, but it was winter, and my back door and my base freezer apartment were under a storm door, locked from the inside. This was weekend 6 after Snowmageddon, so my back door under a storm door, locked from the inside, is also 3 feet under of snow. Eventually the tapping became so frequent, I decided to investigate. As I got closer to the door and tapping sound, I put my ear up to the door, and as I did, it went from clapping to slamming. All I could think to say is, "I know you could go, please go away," and ran into my house. The next day, I gathered enough courage to open the door. The padlock was still done. I went through my kitchen's neighbour upstairs to get into the backyard, and my storm cellar was still under the pristine blanket of snow, and no one had been able to bear it or roll it into a cat or a snowman. Every now and again, there's certain important situations I'll hear about the taps, and usually followed by something benign or mischievous. Despite a few creepy instances as a child, there has only been one time in my adult life that I have truly felt primal fear. I live in a village in the middle of the English countryside. To paint an accurate picture of its size, it has a population of 4,000, but it feels more like 1,000 due to its spread of nature and being surrounded on all sides by lots of fields, farms, and woods that eventually connect onto a pretty famous forest. It's kind of on the middle of nowhere, and because of this, it has notoriously bad phone and internet connections. Having lived here all my life, I know the place like the back of my hand. I know where all the public footpaths through the woods and fields are, and where they connect to, and where to cross deep streams. I have gone on walks in this area throughout my childhood, with parents and alone as an adult. Nothing bad has ever happened, and I felt safe here. This story takes place last summer in July, after I moved back home from university. I had yet to get a job and smoked a lot of weed, a habit my parents despised, and which I tried to keep hidden from them by going for evening walks. Multiple pre-rolled joints hidden away in my hoodie pocket. As usual, this day they both got home at 5 p.m. We had dinner, but chatted for a while longer than usual, as my mother had quite a hectic day and was telling me all about it. Because of this, I ended up heading out for my walk an hour later than routine, about 7 p.m. But as it was summer, the sun was still shining, so honestly, I didn't really notice that it would start getting dark while I was still out. The woodlands closest to my house are less than 5 minutes away, and you enter through a gate into a farmer's field. You can see across the open area quite far, until the first set of small woods obscures your view. That is where I was heading, and I knew this track takes under 2 hours and leads back onto the same path I was standing on now. More than enough time to smoke 3 joints in my pocket, and for the smell to leave my clothing. This entire area is very popular for dog walkers, so it's not unusual to see other people while you are about, and as this is a village, everybody says hello to everybody. I lit my first joint, and I started walking. I'm just in my own world. Until I was less than 100 feet before the entrance of the woods. At which point, an elderly man was coming out of them, throwing a ball for his border collie. I finished my joint and stubbed it out, and as I got closer, I recognized it as John, who lived on the road next to mine, and knew my grandpa. We stopped, said hello, and I stroked his dog, Max. While talking, I see another man coming out of the woods. No dog, just a bright green jacket. Very tall. And he had a good 10 years on me age-wise. Me and John chat for just another minute and say goodbye. He warns me not to stay out too late, as it was getting dark. True, the sky was now a bright pink and orange, and the sun was indeed beginning to set. I hadn't really noticed. I continued on down the path towards the man, where we went nearly passing each other. We did make brief eye contact, smiled and said hello like everybody else does. When my eyes met his, he was already looking at me. His dark eyes locked on mine, and he wasn't smiling. I didn't know him at all, but I knew something was wrong. It was in his eyes. I swallowed my politeness and looked at the ground as we passed. I had lived in my university city for the past couple of years, so I knew a red flag when I saw one, and my country bumpkin manners evaporated. I quickened my pace a little, and before entering the woods slyly, I looked back. The guy was still walking in the same direction, following John. I felt relieved, laughed, cursed the weed for making me paranoid, and, as expected, lit up another and started walking deeper into the woods. It takes about 30 minutes to follow the path through the woods to the end. The pathway exit opened into another field that led to another set of woods. The sky was now violet, the dimming light having been obscured to me by the trees. I was already smoking my last joint, and was near the entrance of the second set of woods when I felt it. Fear. Complete, crippling fear. Absolute fear. And it worked its way like electricity through every layer of my flesh. I'd never felt anything like it before or since, but I knew what it was, and I whipped around. Standing at the exit of the first set of woods was the man. I could still make out his green jacket in the fading light. He's doubled back, and very quickly too, I thought. I had looked back several times while in those trees, and he hadn't been there. For a second I froze, as did he. He knew I'd seen him. To sprint the distance between us would take him about 5 minutes, and he was obviously in good shape. I threw the spliff and bolted into the woods. The only way I could go, and I didn't dare look behind me. I sprinted for a couple of minutes before taking a sharp left turn off the path into the trees, hoping to throw him off a bit, and I couldn't see a bloody thing. The light was already darkening, and the trees made it 100 times worse, especially as I was now in the thick of them, their branches catching on my clothes like fingers, whipping and scratching my bare legs, and I bled as I ran. My lungs protested in pain, hating me for smoking so much, while my heart was throwing itself against my ribcage trying to escape. I couldn't anymore. I threw myself on the ground behind a particularly thick trunk, my back against it, knees to my chest, hand over my mouth to stifle my laboured breathing, desperately trying to pump air into my lungs for the next sprint. I listened for the first time, and a few seconds passed silently. Then I heard him. The sound of heavy footfalls and snapping twigs were prevalent, and he was about 20 feet to my left. I dare not look in case he sees me. I have my phone, but I knew that there was little chance of getting signal where I was. I knew he would either hear me talking or see the light from the display. I'm not ashamed to say it, but at this point I started to cry, the tears falling silently down my cheeks. "What the hell?" I hear a deep voice say. "Where are you? I know you're here. I saw you." I have to clasp both my hands across my mouth to stop my screams escaping. I can hear him moving around, and I panic, and I find enough courage to slowly peek from behind the tree. He was about 10 feet behind me, less than 20 feet to the left, with his back to me. I moved back, and my eyes searched the area around me. I picked up a pretty heavy rock, and I carefully checked on him again. His back is still turned, but he's searching through the trees, hunched down lower to the ground now. And I make a snap decision, and with everything I had left, I threw the rock behind me and to the right. It clattered through the branches of the trees and made one hell of a noise. I watched him immediately bolt in its direction, laughing. I paused a little, hearing his footsteps get quieter, until I thought I wouldn't be so visible to him. So I moved and threw myself forward, and ran, putting as much distance between us as possible. But I was also aware that I was getting further and further away from home. I knew there had to be a stream somewhere close. If I found the stream, I can follow it, as it borders the land and runs parallel to some of the footpaths. So I ran, and I ran, and I ran, until the trees finally cleared, and I can just make out another field through them on the other side. I thanked God, and pushed myself a little bit further, till I'm out of the trees, and the ground disappeared below my feet, and I go head over heels into the stream embankment. I crash into the water below, my mouth open and my lungs filling with muddy water. As I splutter it out, I feel both relieved to have found the stream and terrified he's heard me. My phone is now ruined. I slowly make my way downstream as quietly as possible, listening out for him the whole time, as the stream borders the woods, looking up periodically just in case. After a while, maybe half an hour, I notice the trees begin to thin out, and realize this is the edge of the woods where I would have been exiting, where the pathways connected to the original one I'd started on. If I ran, I could get home in less than 20 minutes. As quietly as I could, I dragged myself on my stomach back up the embankment army style, wanting to stay as low as possible. I peeked over the top, and I could just make out the opening of the wood's exit path about 50 feet away. I scanned the forest line for a couple of minutes, my eyes trying to make out movement, despite it being pitch black. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything either. I pushed myself and sprinted as fast as I could across the field onto the pathway. I knew the gate I'd entered through was in the adjoining field, and it wasn't really that far. I was so happy. And then I heard a scream fly across the field. "You bitch." And I swear my legs nearly gave out there and then. He had been waiting for me. I turned my head and saw him sprinting out of the woods at full pelt. I screamed and pushed myself further, tears coating my face. All I could do was run. I crossed into the main field, and now I could see the moonlight shining off the metal gate. My house was just 5 minutes away after that. I have never focused on anything as much as that gate. He was faster than me, and getting closer, screaming at me the whole time about he was going to slit my throat. I ran and ran, pushing myself up and over the gate, and I ran up the road. I dared look as I made the turning for my road, and he was still following me. I raced up my driveway and threw myself at the door, running into the living room, crying and screaming hysterically, pointing behind me towards the door. My dad ran outside, while my mum grabbed a hold of me as I was collapsed and shaking. As it turns out, my parents had already called the police, as I said I was going out for an hour or so, and that was at 7. And with it being well past midnight and I hadn't answered the phone, it was very unlike me. We called the police again to explain. They came and I gave a full statement. Both my parents and the police were horrified. Nothing like this happens here. There hasn't been a report of rape or murder in the last 100 years. But one look at me, and it was obvious I was telling the truth. I was covered head to toe in cuts and bruises, soaking wet and covered in mud and blood. I wouldn't go into how this experience changed me. It's depressing. But I will say the thing that scares me the most is that they never even had a suspect. Despite him following me so closely, he was gone by the time my dad ran out. That guy is still out there, and who knows what he's really capable of. The most paranormal thing I've experienced was probably the time when a friend of mine and my brother tried to communicate with ghosts. Me and my friend were having a drink downstairs, and I came out of the kitchen and turned off the light that was shining outside, and I sat down. He said the light just blinked, and after a couple of minutes, we decided we should try and make contact with ghosts to see if there were any in my house. At this point, my grandfather had been 3 years dead and my dog less than a year, and were the only things I knew of that died nearby. So after we made the Ouija board, my brother came downstairs and joined us. We decided that we were going to give it 3 tries. The first time nothing really happened, except for a little bit of movement of the glass that could have easily been one of us. The second try went basically the same, but my brother felt some chills down his spine, and I thought I saw a weird kind of mist walking past the couch he was sitting on. On the third time, we didn't think something would happen, since nothing had happened the first 2 times, and we wanted to leave. And then we heard an extremely loud bang from the other side. At that time, I thought the wall had collapsed, or was something in nature, but it scared the living shit out of me, and everyone after that happened turned on the light, and we saw that a portrait of my dog had been ripped off the wall. It was impossible to do so even with bare hands, and after that, we rushed upstairs and tried to go to sleep. I didn't have so much trouble with it, because if it were my dog it would have been awesome. But I've heard other things in the house as well, which makes me consider it profoundly. A friend and I had some time to kill before heading to another friend's house for the night. We decided to take a stroll down a popular walking path in my town that runs through a field of tall, thick brush. So tall that you can't see over it. So we're about 15 minutes into the walk when we decide that we've gone far enough and it was time to turn around and walk back to our car. On the way back, I noticed a large, dark green electrical box in the distance, alongside the path, which was weird because there's nothing around to power. As we get closer, I said to my friend, I really don't remember that electrical box being there before. And as soon as my friend said, yeah, that's weird, me either, I shit you not, the electrical box shot into the brush at instantaneous velocity, uninterrupted by any bushes or trees that may have been there. We both stopped in our tracks and stood there speechless for 60 seconds, looking forward with our jaws hanging open. We were both in such disbelief at what we had just seen that we could not form a coherent thought. We eventually looked at each other and decided that we had to keep walking away to get to the car. So we walked up to where the box was, and there was absolutely no sign of anything breaking in the brush. This thing easily would have broken a few bushes down or snapped a tree branch, as it looked exactly like a 4x5x5 electrical box, and it shot into the brush as if it was afraid of us. This was the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me, and it's not even a cool story to tell my other friends, because it's a haunted electrical box, but it was absolutely terrifying at the time. And you know what? It still is when I think about it. I don't want to walk there anymore. Let me give you some background information. I am 18 and living in Dagenham. It's quite a busy area, so there are normally a lot of people around. This particular night, me and my friend Jim were on our way to camp out at the local park. You were never allowed there past 10 p.m, so we would have to hide from the park police. The park we were staying at was always busy up until around 9 p.m. Then it turns to a ghost field. Anyway, on to the story. We had set out for the park at about 8:30, so by the time we got there wouldn't be anyone there to grass us up. We arrived and everything went according to plan. We had the tent, snacks, portable DVD player, and Pokemon Go at the ready. It was perfect. 10 p.m. came and we heard the park police shutting up the gates. There's quite a lot of them, so it's always easy to hear the gates creak. Once we were sure the police had left, we decided to whip out our phones and play some Pokemon Go. There was a Pokestop in the park, and I had a Lure module to use. We'd been playing for about half an hour when we heard a loud bang come from the gate, like someone had run into it. Dagenham is known for its drunks, so we shook it off as nothing. To cut a long story short, we went back to the tents, watched a couple of action films and went to sleep. Not even an hour into my sleep, I woke up with a horrible sense of dread, like someone was watching me. All of my senses were heightened, and something wasn't right. I heard some crunching coming from behind the tent. I thought it must have been a fox until I heard it. Or, should I say, them. I managed to make out the words, "They're gonna hear us. Keep your damn mouth shut." And I quietly but violently shook Jim to wake up and told him what I'd heard. I needed to make sure I wasn't crazy, so I asked him to listen. Whilst listening, his face turned white and the fear spread across his face. He grabbed my arm hard and whispered, "We need to make a run for it. Just trust me." I didn't hesitate. We're quite athletic people, so running isn't a problem. And we slowly unzipped the tent and with one big breath made a mad dash for the gates. We heard pounding footsteps and heavy breathing behind us as a guy shouted in a horrible musky voice, "Oi, slow down, we just want to play with you." And both the guys started laughing madly. Like, seriously. It was a seriously messed up laugh. We made it to the fence and leapt over it with ease. The rest was just a mad dash to my house, which was only around the corner. We made it back, slammed the door, ran up to my room and peeked out the bedroom window. We saw both guys sprint past my house, both holding something metallic. It was hard to see as it was pitch black due to the street lamp being out. Go figure. At that moment I turned to Jim and asked him why he looked so terrified back in the tent. He then went on to explain that he heard the guy say, "You grab the small one, the large one's mine. The bigger they are, the bigger the challenge." That terrified me, and we went back to the tent the next morning and found all of our stuff destroyed. The tent was slashed, portable DVD player was snapped in half, and all of our food was thrown all over the place. We never told anyone. I think we were too proud to say we ran away. All I know is that I'm never going camping again. Last summer, I was camping out with a couple of friends. We were deep in the woods, and we had built ourselves a campfire. There were 5 of us in total, 2 guys and 3 girls. We were in a pretty remote part of the woods, but nobody was really worried. Anyway, we stayed up late, talking about life, telling stories and having a great time. At around 11:30, one of the girls, Ashley, shushed everyone for a second and said that she heard something. Once we were all quiet, everyone admitted to being able to hear a faint sound that resembled footsteps, but we all agreed that it was a raccoon or something. Fast forward to about an hour and a half. We were talking when suddenly we heard a very loud snapping sound, followed by a loud thump. It sounded like a large tree branch was broken off. Some of the girls were getting scared at this point, but we were able to calm them down. And eventually, we decided to try and get some sleep, and we were able to. Sometime through the night, I woke up. I have absolutely no idea how or why, but I did. I checked my phone, and it was 2:30 a.m. I lied there, staring up at the stars for a while, trying to go back to sleep. I then began to hear footsteps. They were very faint and sounded like they did earlier. They began to get noticeably closer, and after probably 5 minutes, sounded like they were only 10 feet out of range from the small amount of light still shining from our campfire. They then stopped. I waited, but there was nothing. I had a terrible feeling of being watched, and for the first time in a long time, I was truly horrified. I lied completely still, and did so for the next half hour or so. Somehow I drifted off, and at around 4:15 I heard a scream coming from the wilderness. I was incredibly exhausted, and only about half awake, but I know what I heard. It wasn't high-pitched. It sounded like whatever it was had a horrible sore throat or something. And by morning, I convinced myself it was a dream. Josh, the other guy I was camping with, mentioned it. He said it like it was nothing. Like, "Damn, did you hear that scream from the woods last night?" All I can remember about it was that I said it sent a chill down my entire body, and he just was super casual about it like it was nothing. Like I said, it was in a very remote part of the woods, and I was driving with my buddy in the middle of the outback of Australia, in a camper van that we were living out of for the past month. Now in the outback, there are really, really long stretches of road that just go straight for kilometre after kilometre, and a whole lot of nothing, and you can see for miles and miles. We were driving from Cobar to Broken Hill, and the thing about driving in the outback of Australia is that it is the Wild West and well known for serial killers. And I remember we came over one hill and just saw the strangest cloud formation on the horizon, and we just kept getting closer and closer. This was fun, because when there isn't much to look at, a giant black cloud during sunset was pretty sweet. So this cloud was forming out of nowhere, and it kept getting bigger, and suddenly we saw it. It was a huge fire. I drove as fast as my 1982 Toyota Hiace could drive, and all I could think of was, oh crap, people must be in trouble. We get a bit closer and we realise that it's not one fire, but two, and I pushed my van as hard as I dared. We finally got close enough to see a bit more of the picture, and it was these two extremely large trees, over 100 years old, which makes no sense in the middle of the outback, and they were both completely engulfed in flames. But this isn't even the weird part. As we approached, there was a station wagon in the ditch that runs along the side of the road, with its lights on and the engine still running. By this point, we had rolled up to the scene and noticed people in normal clothes standing and staring at the tree fires, while a man with, I assumed was a Bible, preached at them with very fire and brimstone-y. We pulled up into our van and they started walking towards us. Being completely freaked out by the scene we stumbled upon, I floored it to the next town. We told people at the next town what we had seen, and they looked at us like we had 3 heads. I am a uni student now, but this incident happened when I was in the 8th grade. When I was around 14, I studied a subject focusing on outdoor pursuits. For our final assessment, 2 teachers took my class on a one-night camp where we would do activities like rock climbing, kayaking, and trail walking. I live in Australia, around an hour from a state forest that was notorious for the backpacker murders. Several bodies have been found, and several more remain missing. I'm pretty sure all the murders relate to the same killer. Anyway, in the morning, we leave the school and drive out in a bus. When we reach the road that leads to the entrance of the forest, a police car is parked to the side. He spoke to the teacher for a moment, but I didn't hear anything, and no one else seemed to notice or care. Fast forward a few hours, and we've trekked to the camping area somewhere in the middle of the state forest. Some parts are state and some are privately owned, I think. While kayaking that afternoon, we noticed a helicopter doing flybys, but again my classmates never suspected a thing. A couple of mates and I were the first to leave the water, and helped the teacher with some equipment and started building our own rafts. I was standing off to the side when one of the national park guides walked over to one of the instructors and talked in hushed, slightly stressed out tones. I remember the instructor saying stuff like, "You're kidding, I don't believe you," and he looked incredibly shocked and taken aback. So at this point I started connecting the dots, but I didn't say anything to my school friends. And around dusk that night, I go to use the toilet, which is around 100 meters from the main campsite. As I go in, I remember a guy walking around the other side of the block. I didn't see him very clearly in the diminished light, but he kept glancing around with nervous body language. I couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't part of our party, and to me, he just didn't fit. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but fast forward to the next morning when we got back to the car park. The teacher tells us that a body was found in a dam not far from where we were. They didn't want to tell us as to not frighten us, and we later found out it was a young guy who was killed with an axe, and the guy who did it was related to the serial killer who hunted in the same area. I don't know if the guy I saw had anything at all to do with the murders, but it freaked me out a lot afterwards, and I have not been camping since. The final story is about a girl named Kate. Kate was at a boarding school when she had her haunting experience. It was an American boarding school in England, a building that dates back to the 1600s. During Kate's first year at school, her dorm was above an old coach house for the horses that was built near the school's main building, an old mansion. The coach house adjoins a strange tall building that also has a dormitory. At one time in history, the building was a convent or a nunnery, where religious nuns once lived. One night, Kate was up, finishing some very late homework. It was about 2:30 a.m., and one of her roommates was still studying, and another roommate was getting ready to go to bed. As I was organizing my books, we suddenly hear whispering coming from the outside of the window to our rooms. It was whispering, Kate. The windows looked down over the garden that connected the old nunnery building. One room was 4 stories up off the ground, and the whistling sounded like it was coming from directly outside the window, as if something was hovering there. Too afraid to investigate any further, the 3 girls just sat up and stared at the window, listening to the whistling. After a few moments it stopped. There was no wind that night, Kate remembers, and we could not have even screamed that loudly. There was no wind that night, Kate remembers, and they couldn't have just heard someone whistling nearby on the ground. Besides, who does that at 2:30 a.m.? Many tales have been told about the nunnery building, about a nun who committed suicide years ago, and there was one outside the window that night whistling to me. I guess I'll never know. I was out camping with my mum and then 6-year-old brother when a white pickup truck pulls up into our campsite. 3 or 4 guys then get out of the truck, all wearing small, bright white lights attached to their hats that blind us from seeing their faces. They approach my mum and start asking her questions about who we were and what our plans are for the night. My little brother starts whimpering and stopped eating the Doritos he'd been happily munching on. And I got the impression that my mom was creeped out as well. So the men leave after about 5 minutes and told my mum that they were official campground employees who were just making sure that everyone was alright. Their truck certainly didn't look official, and they weren't wearing anything that would suggest that they were more than just regular albeit creepy dudes wandering around and being nosy. My mum told my brother and we went to get in the car, and only took the essentials like clothes and a bit of food, as per her instructions. And we went to my grandmother's house and spent the rest of the night there instead. We left the tent at the campsite, giving the illusion that we were still there. Next morning, after we had told my grandmother about what happened and that we were suspicious, we went back to the campsite to gather our things and head home. When we pulled up, we immediately noticed that our stuff had been picked through by someone who wasn't us. There were footprints leading up to our tent, and the zipper was stuck, halfway open, like someone was trying to close it. It was closed when we left it, you see, and they didn't succeed. Our sleeping bags also had boot prints on them, and we never saw those guys again. But I still wonder, what would have happened if we'd have stayed? Oh boy, this story makes me shudder. We were traveling with another couple who had budget restrictions, and we needed to find a last-minute place to stay in Las Vegas. We had been looking forward to a nice hotel with a pool to kick it by and just chill out. They couldn't afford it, so they found a super cheap Airbnb with a pool. We were trying to be good, flexible travelers, so agreed to compromise. As we were driving to the place, I tried to ignore the increasing amount of poverty and strung out people on drugs on the street looking lost. We pulled into the apartment lot, and I said nothing. My husband and I looked over to each other. It looked like a seedy apartment place from District 13. As we walked into the building, I was overcome with the smell. It was sweet, and at the same time horrible beyond belief, with a layer of perfume on top. My body would not let me breathe in the smell, and I had to just cover my mouth with my sleeve in order to breathe. I was on the tail end of the flu, so I'd been nauseous for days and figured that I was just being sensitive. We hurried to see the pool, and it had a big under renovation sign. Covering my mouth, we went back into the building. We checked out our apartment, and it was clean, and the smell didn't permeate into it, so we agreed to stay. That next morning, I woke up having the worst dream of my life. People getting shot and hurt and beaten up. Constant drama and horror all night in my head. And my husband seemed interested in what I had dreamt, and I didn't want to get into it, so I just said it was people getting hurt. When I got home a couple of days later, I brought up the smell in the hallway. It wasn't until then that he told me that it was the odor of a badly decayed human corpse. My husband is a paramedic, so his nose gets to experience the very worst of humanity. On this night, my ex, a type A personality and aggressive driver, and I were making a 15-hour drive straight through from the Midwest to Texas. He never let me take the wheel or sleep, so the more exhausted he became, the worse the trip. By the time we'd reached Texarkana, it was 3 a.m. We hadn't seen another vehicle in an hour, and his nerves were on my nerves. Ahead of us were finally dim taillights. Pulling within a couple of car lengths, we see a semi. Even though there were no other cars around, my ex makes an unnecessarily violent swerve to the left to pass. I screamed what the hell when he jerked right behind the semi again. He started off on one of his rants, something about another truck. Right beside our driver door, like a foot,
was another semi. Inside our car was a madhouse, as these two semis boxed us in out of nowhere. My ex is having a screaming gesture, having a proper fit. I get a close look at the driver, right beside us. Damned if he didn't look like a young Charles Manson. Wild, dark hair, crazy eyes, and cackling. I was glad I couldn't hear. But something was off. Or even more off. The wild-eyed trucker was filming my ex ranting on an old camcorder. I laughed hard, and the ex wasn't amused. I said, "That driver does this for kicks, don't you get it?" My ex still sees no humor. I bet you anything that we're going to show up on a tape at his next party, along with anyone else he got. The driver pulled ahead, and out of sight, when he saw me laugh. Of course, my ex bitched the rest of the way there. And that's why he's the ex. I am a 26-year-old male, and I had been planning a camping trip with my wife and father for a whole year. I wanted everything to be perfect, as we don't get away from town and dive deep into the woods as often as I'd like to. This takes place in the very tree-dense Davy Crockett National Forest in East Texas. Earlier that day, my dad decided to go early and pick out a good spot for us to camp. To give a layout of where we camped, and there were 2 dirt roads on either side of us, and up an overlook to the north of us. We camped in the middle between the 2 roads. My wife and I arrived and met my dad down there at around 11 a.m. We set up our camp and proceeded to enjoy the day until around dinner time, when we started to cook our meal for the evening. Right as we got done with dinner, we see this truck circling around our campsite. He went around us several times and finally pulled right up into our campsite and got out of his truck. He then proceeded to tell us that this was his family's campsite, and how the firewood that was laying on the ground was his. Now, in this particular forest, campsites are first come, first served, and my dad had been there since 9 a.m. He then asked if he could camp next to us, and of course, being friendly, we said yes. We didn't know that when he said next to us, he meant directly on top of us. He backed his camper in so close to our tent that he blocked my truck in. We weren't sure why he was doing this, being that there were so many other campsites available, but we just shrugged it off and tried to have a good time anyway. Not that long after, we noticed a white Dodge casually circling us. We had an off feeling from this truck, because it went around several times, but we dismissed it because the area was so popular due to the overlook. After a long night of drinking and goofing off, we decided to go to bed. I was in a dead sleep when out of the woods, I wake up to a blood-curdling scream. I jolt up and ask my wife what the hell that was, and about 30 seconds later, we hear another scream off in the distance. At this point, I grabbed my gun, unzipped my tent so that we could see out of it, and my dad had left a lantern burning so that we could see a little ways into our campsite. At that moment, we see the white Dodge tearing down the road behind us. They continued down the road until they were out of sight. We heard them stop and get out of their truck, slamming the door and screaming. They then proceeded to get into their truck and drive very slowly to the other road that was in front of the campsite. At this point we were terrified, thinking that they were coming to rob us, but they kept driving until they were out of sight, and then we heard them shooting. After the gunshots ended, they sped off, and at this point we thought that maybe they were just drunk and acting stupid, so we didn't call the cops. And we didn't have signal anyway, so we tried to just go back to sleep. The next day we had to make a beer run for my dad, and when we made it out the camping area and hit the highway, there were police everywhere. They had stopped two young boys, who we assumed were the ones who were being troublemakers the night before and continued into town. When we got back to our campsite, the cops were leaving after talking to my dad. They told my dad that the guys in the white dually had gone into a young guy's camp while they were hunting and robbed him. The boys walked up on their camp being robbed, and the Dully guys pulled guns on the young boys, proceeding to rob them at gunpoint. We think if it hadn't have been for the people that camped right next to us, as strange as it was, they would have robbed us instead. They made our campsite look bigger than it actually was, and the people in the white dually were never caught. So, people in a white Dodge, please, let's never meet again. Because if you do, you may end up with a bullet in your head. This incident happened to my mum over 20 years ago. She worked at a local pub. The pub mainly catered for fishermen, as the town is off the western coast of Australia. So she knew most of the people who would come in for drinks or a feed. However, every now and again, people from town would come in. She told me one bloke used to come in who she knew from house parties around the place, and always wanted to talk to her while she was working, and would say sorry and keep doing her thing. One night, she finished work at around midnight and walked home a few kilometers away. She lived with a few housemates who were blokes, all good mates. When she got home from her shift, she decided to have a shower. Making her way back to her room, she realized her door was open, which is normally shut. All the fellas were asleep, so she blew it off as wind or something. She laid down in bed to go to sleep, but something didn't feel right, for reasons that she can't explain, and she felt the need to look under her bed. What she saw under the bed was the bloke from the bar who had followed her all the way from work. She tells me that she just stared at him for ages, and he didn't move nor breathe, to the point she thought he was dead. She went out of her room calmly and went to one of the guys' rooms to tell them she had a dead bloke under her bed. They raced in with a baseball bat to find the guy halfway out the window. He managed to escape and run away. The police were called, and because they all knew who he was, the cops picked him up next day. The thing that bothers me the most is what his intentions were with my mum that night. Arsehole gets a fine and was never allowed back in town. Too soft, in my opinion. This is a story from a road trip that my fiancé and I took back in 2010. Our trip had been relatively benign and uneventful, with a few exceptions. One of those was a trip through Colorado. We were on our way to the Rocky Mountains National Park, but it was getting dark and we needed to stop for the night. A quick look at the road atlas showed us that there were a few campgrounds a short hop away. After a short discussion, we decided to try and find a few of them. The paved roads turned into an unpaved washboard-like trail. The trees around us turned from pine to birch, and the forest just felt wrong somehow. But we continued onwards nevertheless, determined to find the damn campground. But after about an hour of driving slowly, so that we didn't shake the car to pieces, we came across one of the camps. The campground was like something from the beginning of a mystery thriller. Everything was overgrown. The fire pits were growing weeds, and the signs were all rusted or shot up, and the moon didn't quite penetrate the trees. We decided that this was not the place for us, and continued onwards. Another hour of driving passed, and it was pitch black, and the roads got amazingly tough in spots for our tiny little Avea. We resigned ourselves to another night at sleeping at a rest stop, and began to try and find a way out. Suddenly, we saw bright headlights in the road ahead, and we continued forward and found ourselves in quite a large clearing. Headlights from behind us turned on, blinding us from seeing the roads out. 3 men, wearing various expressions of anger and fear, appeared out of the gloom and approached the car. In the bright lights of the 2 trucks, I could now see a burnt-out trailer, and all the men were wearing black clothing. The look of malice on the man approaching my side of the vehicle burnt its way into my brain, and I was instantly terrified. I yelled at my fiancé to floor it, and he was desperately trying to find the exit. We finally saw the trail marking, reflecting across the clearing, and gunned it out of there, with the men jumping out of the way in surprise. The final half hour before we finally found ourselves back in civilization was spent in creeped-out silence. We stuck to sleeping in rest stops and national parks after that.
When I was 9 or 10, I used to have to lay on the floor to sleep. I'm not sure why I did it. I just found it more comfortable for a while. It was a weird phase. Anyway, I was in my bed, and I had just burritoed myself up in all the blankets and sheets, took my pillows and flopped them on the floor to settle in for the night. I remember rolling over to push away a toy or something near me, so I had the space to sleep, and in that exact moment, a hand came through my floor. It looked as if someone had set its opacity in Photoshop to 65%, and it was definitely human. It reached for me in a grabbing motion. However, I don't think it could grab me, because it went straight through my arm, just passing through it. My body went numb. I'm not sure if it was from touching me, or if it was due to fear, but I didn't think about it. I just ran. And I spent the rest of my night in my mum's room. Another story I have is when I had a birthday party in the same house. I was a little older, maybe 11 or 12, and I had invited 5 or 6 of my best friends to come. We got bored with whatever we were doing, so I suggested we go ghost hunting, since I had a friend who told me that things went on in my house. Strange noises and the feeling of someone watching you, as well as the hand. Being kids, they all loved the idea, and we started roaming the house with our hands posed into finger guns pointing and shooting. It was just a fun game, but then in my living room, I pointed at a random spot near the TV and yelled bang. There was a loud thump, like something big had just been dropped on the floor near where I pointed, and a touch-activated toy near the spot went off, just like in the movies. I remember my face going flush, turning around and exchanging the "you heard it" two-face with my friends.